buying through that partnership, and what is the profit margin. And if the tax department deems that 30% is too high a transfer price, they can reduce that to say 10%, and they'll charge you 20% that profit margin as additional tax in Brunei. Yeah. So when you look at the tax system in Brunei, when you have personal income tax and corporation tax, when you try to avoid one, you have to pay on the other. Yeah. So companies may have a reduced tax, but me as an individual, I'll be taxed because there's personal income tax. So you need to look at what's the tax rate. Do I pay 20% corporation tax, 18%, or 30, 40% personal income tax? Yeah. Or do I want to take it out as dividends? So there are a lot of tax planning issues that needs to be looked into. Okay, let's look at deductible and non-deductible expenses. As I mentioned, if it's a deductible expense, a non-deductible, sorry, disallowable, and then it will be added back to the profit, which would increase the tax liability. So the certain expenses, I mean, for example, penalties and fines. If you get a parking ticket, you're fined for something, and that is not an allowable expense. Yeah. Here it goes to the extreme. If you if you watch some of these mafia movies, especially in America, you have to pay protection money to the gangsters to protect your outlet. That's an expense, yes, but it is not a tax deductible expense. Of course, any payment for bribes will not be bribes or commissions to people. Yeah, it's not an allowable expense. How will the tax department find out? They will have to be smart, or you have to be smart as to how you put it into your financial statements. Okay. Now, capital expenditure. When you get an exam question, when you see depreciation, depreciation is not an allowable expense for tax purposes. Yeah, depreciation is a measure of wear and tear of the use of fixed assets over its useful economic life, whether it's 3 years, 5 years. Reducing balance method, straight line basis, is entirely up to the company to decide what its accounting policy is. But because depreciation is a disallowable expense, what the government will do is, which is the next chapter, you're able to claim capital allowances on the expenditure that you incur on fixed assets additions on and new assets. Yeah. So we'll cover that next week in terms of the capital expenditure. So yes, depreciation is disallowable, but the government gives capital allowances. Now, what some government do is, if they want to encourage people to buy assets to expand their business, instead of getting a 20% allowance every year from the government in terms of capital allowance, you can get 100% initial allowance. So that 100% initial allowance will totally reduce your tax liability, because the government gives you the deduction upfront, yeah, not spread over 5 years. This is where government has a policy of trying to encourage entrepreneurs to invest and to expand and to innovate their business. Okay. The rest of it you can read. Impairment losses. If you have a debtor, a trade debtor, and obviously the person doesn't pay, it becomes a bad debt. Yeah, so that's an impairment loss. In Brunei, similar to UK as well, there are two types of provision. When you have a list of debtors, and if you look at your financial accounting, there are two types of provision that is made for debtors or for loans for banks and all. One is general provision. So you have maybe debtors of 100,000. Your company policy is to make a 2% general provision, irrespective of how old the debt is. Yeah, 100,000, 2%. So the 2,000 will be as general provision, but then you may have specific provision on individual debtors that you have assessed as being not recoverable. Or you have a policy whereby any debtors in the UK, when I was working in London, anything more than 3 months, it is fully provided. In Brunei, Sometimes I see people have not paid for 1 year, still not provided, yeah, especially government debts. So in some cases, when I've done audits, we see 3 years also debt has not been paid. Now, the important thing for general provision is not allowable for tax purposes. Yeah. So when you make a general provision, you have to add it back onto the profit. So the 2000, as I mentioned example just now, you add back to the profit to increase the taxable profit. For specific provision on individual items, what you need to do is you need to demonstrate that you have recovered or made all efforts to recover the debt. How do you do that? One is, of course, you have taken legal action. You have engaged a lawyer to try to recover the debt for you, or the company has gone into liquidation or receivership. Okay. Sometimes what I do is, when I was working, as I've mentioned, I always go through the Borneo Bulletin to see which companies and individuals have been sued for bankruptcy. Not that I'm happy to see that people are being bankrupt, but from an audit point of view, from an audit evidence point of view, is if one of my clients have been sued for bankruptcy, then obviously I need to consider whether the company is able to pay my past audit fees if they still owe me fees. And if they have paid me, is whether I want to continue as an auditor of this company. When we do audits of banks, finance companies, we sometimes see finance companies and banks suing individuals. So what we need to do is to check when we do the audit to make sure that these individuals' specific provisions have been made. Yeah. So when you get a court order, when you have a receivership order or liquidation order, or a notice in the newspaper for a creditor to appear in court, that's an indication that companies have taken legal action. And so it's a similar case in the UK. It's a similar case in Brunei. Yeah? So impairment losses or bad debts, as it's stated here, only impaired losses where the liability was incurred wholly exclusively for the purpose of trade are deductible for tax purposes. I think they give an example, loans to employees is not a taxable deduction unless it is a bank or financial institution. Okay, entertainment gifts. Entertainment for and gifts to employees are normally deductible. Gifts to charities are allowable. In Brunei, gifts to charities are allowable as long as they have been listed by the Ministry of Finance as being a recognized charitable, like Kacha, Babda, Smarter, Learning Ladders, they have a list, yeah? But you make a donation to the stray cats or stray dogs, because it's not on the list, then it is not an allowable expense. And I've also mentioned before, even if you make a donation to certain celebrations in Brunei, although it might be a significant celebration, if it's not been designated by the tax department as an approved donation to a particular fund, for nationally Sultan's birthday, whatever it is, yeah, then any donation you make, although it is for a certain purpose, it's not allowable for tax purposes. For example, special celebration like Silver Jubilee, Golden Jubilee, yeah, if it's not listed in the Ministry of Finance as a recognized, although it's recognized publicly, but for tax purposes, it's not been listed, the donations you make will be subjected to additional 18.5% tax if you're a tax-paying company. Yeah. Okay, the other thing that you need to look at is lease charges for cars. In the UK, obviously, they are concerned about carbon emission. So if you have a low emission car, it's good because the lease expenses are totally allowable. But if you have leasing costs of a car where the CO2 emission exceeds 110 grams per kilometer, then 15% of that leasing cost will be disallowed. Yeah, and typically in exam question, they'll tell you what kind of a car it is. Mr. A has leased a car where carbon emission is 120. So if you see 120, that means it's more than 110. Immediately it triggers that you have to disallow 15% of that leasing cost. Sometimes in the exam question, there are two examples. Mr. A has a car where the carbon emission is 90 grams per kilometer, and another car which is 120. Yeah, so you need to decide which is fully allowable and which you have to add back the 15%. Okay. In Brunei, we have not. Actually, I'm a speaker later on the green economy and about sustainable development. I was looking at Brunei's SDG objectives. So we haven't got anything in terms of giving incentive for low hybrid cars, EV cars, and all that yet. But obviously in Brunei, electric cars, electric vehicles are still very expensive. We don't have the infrastructure. It's nothing worse. You have an electric car, you start going and then go down to KB, and suddenly after 80 kilometers, you find out that your power, your battery is already coming to an end, like your mobile phone. Yeah? But there are no places to plug to charge your car. So we need to improve on the infrastructure first. I think, of course, by 2035, the government has got policies to increase hybrid cars or EV cars, yeah, electronic vehicles. Hybrid cars, which is electronic and a bit of petrol. Yeah? So once they improve the infrastructure, maybe the government will come out with policies to give additional capital allowance for companies who invest in EV cars, and maybe other additional allowances. Yeah? I found out in London that if you have an electric car, you don't have to pay congestion charges when you go into central London. And when you park your car in London, you pay only 20% of the parking fees of a normal car. Yeah. So the reason why the government has done that is because they want to encourage people to use low carbon emission cars. Yeah. Okay. Now let's look at page 113. And page 113 basically is a typical example of a kind of exam question that will come out, but it also covers almost every item that you need to know in terms of whether the expense is allowable or not. Yeah. So I'll give you 1 minute to read. Hopefully you all have your textbook, or at least access to a textbook. If some of you don't, then sincere apologies. But you can get page 113 and up to 115 from someone, hopefully. Yeah. So just look at the statement of profit and loss of John, a trader. So this is a statement for the year ended 31st May 2018. He's got a gross profit of 79,500. What are his other income, bank interest income, expenses? So in this example, there's only about 7 expenses here: wages and salaries, rent, depreciation, motor expenses, car owned by the business, motor expenses, cost of a leased car, emission of 120 grams per kilometer, entertainment expenses to customers, and office expenses. And then finance costs, interest payable on overdraft. Now, if you look at the notes, what does the note say? Salaries include 10,000 paid to John's wife. Okay. John's wife, Julie, who works part-time in the business. If John had employed another person to do this work, he would have to pay at least this amount. Okay, so better than he has to pay at least this amount. There might be a different scenario where it could be if John had employed another person to do this work, John would have to pay 8,000 to this person. So if you see that statement, that means he's paying his wife 10,000, but someone else was to be employed. They will only be paid 8,000. That 2,000 difference will be a disallowable expense, because it is viewed that he is paying his wife above the market rate. Yeah. So in this example, it says John would have to pay at least this amount. So whether he recruits his wife or someone else, he will still incur a salary of 10,000. Okay. Note number 2, motor expenses on cars owned by the business are 3,000 for John, which is used 20% privately, and 2,000 for his part-time salesman, used 40% privately. Okay, bear that in mind. Capital allowance, £860. So we have depreciation here of 1,005, the third expense item, and which will be an allowable expense, disallowable, but at the same time you get capital allowances of £860. The lease of the car started on 1st May 2018, no private use on the lease car. And as I mentioned in the first page, the exact question we always ask, compute the adjusted taxable profit, the taxable trade profit for the year 31st May 2018. You should start with the net profit figure of 10,400. Yeah, you can see the net profit, yeah? 10,400. And it's stated here, you should start with the net profit figure of 10,400 and then indicate by the use of zero any items which do not require adjustment. And although, I don't know, maybe it's carelessness or panic, or maybe students have left it to the last question. Even some students, you know, it says you should start. They've already told you that you must use 10,400. Some students use some other figure. Yeah. I can only think of maybe students panicking or just left this to the last minute that they went totally blurred and totally blank. Yeah, which is, I mean, I was a student before. Sometimes, yeah, you do get blank and you see different things. Yeah, but if you start with the wrong figure, you already get the wrong answer anyway. Yeah, so by just even putting 10,400, you already get half a mark or 1 mark anyway. Okay, so when you look at the answers, you must list down all the items. So wages and salaries, you put, yeah, you list it down, wages and salary, 0. You do not have to add back because all the salaries are allowable. If the note 1 says that John would have to pay 8,000 for someone to do the same work as the wife, the difference between 10 and 8 would be added back, yeah, 2,000 as wage and salary as a disallowable expense. Because from the point of view of the tax department, you have overpaid your wife. And to them, they see it as a tax planning measure. Now, rents and rates generally is an allowable expense. Yeah? There's nothing unique about this because when you rent office premises, when you have a building, you need to pay rates. The rates equivalent in Brunei is macam cukai pintu na. So assessment and all that, yeah. So that is an allowable expense. So you write down rents and rates and put 0. Depreciation is a capital expenditure. Depreciation is always disallowable. When you see depreciation, whether it's this example or when you turn further on corporation tax for companies, it is added back. Yeah, so just add back 1,005. Traders, motor expenses. It says here that he uses 20% privately. Yeah. So the business expense 3,000, he uses privately 20%. So 600 of it is disallowable because he is not using the car exclusively for the purpose of the business. Private use, maybe, I don't know, you know, it could be sending children to school and doing other things which is non-business related. Now the salesman's car, you'll see a note on the next page. Yeah, the salesman's car will be fully allowable simply because it will be the salesman that will be taxed individually under his own personal income tax. Yeah, and if you look at note 2,000 for his part-time salesman and he uses it 40%. For salesman, because he's an employee, he will be assessed under his own personal income tax. Okay, and not the company. So for the company, that is a allowable expense. Now what we do have next? The lease. Where is it? Okay. You can see here under motor expenses, cost of lease car with an emission of 120 grams per kilometer, 500 pounds. As I mentioned earlier, if anything, in these cars, a CO emission of more than 110, you need to disallow 15% of these costs. Okay? This is a common mistake by students. Some students put it as 0 because they forget that what the threshold is. And sometimes in exams, we have two motor vehicles, one CO emission of 120, one is 100. Yeah. So then sometimes students may have to say, oh, some students disallow both, some allow both, some gets it right. Yeah. The first one is total allowable. The second one is disallowed 15% of these costs. Okay. Entertainment expenses of customers. If you just read the book, the textbook, this is usually not allowable. In Brunei, it's a bit odd because if you have Hari Raya function, Chinese New Year function for your staff, the taxman somehow disallow those expenses. To me, I'm of the view that as long as every staff benefits equally from this expense, then it should be an allowable expense because it's a company expense. So sometimes as a company, you need to have outings, dinners, social gatherings, which is part and parcel of staff motivation, staff morale, and staff networking. But in Brunei, somehow the tax department has disallowed these expenses. But for entertainment of customers, it's disallowable, but entertainment expense of staff, it is allowable. And then office expenses is an allowable expense, yeah, because there's no specific notes here. Now, some other examples, I can give you some examples. Now, as I mentioned, impairment loss. So you may have in expense bad debts provision, yeah? Bad debts. Sometimes they say bad debt trade, non-trade. If you see trade, obviously trade is totally allowable. Non-trade, it is not allowable because it's not linked to the generation of income of the business. Yeah. So just have, okay, I mean, no, you don't have an exam, but in an exam, there will usually I will put impairment losses or provision for bad debt, specific, general, trade or non-trade. Yeah. Then you have to decide what is allowable and what is not allowable. Okay. So maybe let's see. Yeah, okay. That is given an example on page 116. Okay. So if you turn over the page 114 about all other expenses. Now, in terms of subscription and donations, the general wholly exclusive rule applies. The rule determines the deductibility of the expense. So they gave some examples here. Yeah? So for example, at KPMG, because I'm a member of a professional accounting body, any subscription to any professional body, the Brunei Institute of CPA or the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales, because it's related to my trade, will be generally a deductible expense. Yeah. Charitable donations, yes, as long as it's in the list of recognized charitable organizations. Political donations, well, Brunei, we don't have any political parties, but in UK and a lot of countries, there are different political parties. Any donations to political parties are not deductible for tax purposes. Okay. Now, legal and professional charges. If you incur legal charges on a capital item, obviously it is not allowable. But if you incur legal charges for the recovery of trade debtors, because it's a trade item, then it is an allowable expense. Interest paid by an individual on borrowings for the purpose of his trade is allowable. Yeah. So let's look at miscellaneous deductions. So the next two pages, 114, 115, has talked about, has given a few examples. Educational costs for staff. Educational costs, training is a tax deductible. It's an allowable expense. In Brunei, you get a double deduction if you train new staff. So if I have a training expense of 10,000, yeah, for all the staff that I've trained, included in the 10,000 is the 50% of new staff. Then I can get an additional, instead of 10,000, I get a 15,000 deduction of my tax. Because what the Brunei government wants to do is they want to encourage companies to not only recruit, but to train. They want companies to invest in training of their staff. So they do give a double deduction, yeah, on training. Educational costs for trader, it depends, yeah. If it's basically it's for updating of knowledge and skills, but not to acquire new knowledge. I mean, it's a bit of a thin line, but you have to distinguish which is which. Removal expenses to a new business. If I'm moving from Gadong to Syria, the moving expenses will be an allowable expense, yeah, because I am, but if I already have an office in Syria and all I'm doing is trying to move some equipment from Bandar to Syria, that is not considered an allowable expense. It's only, it's not considered as an allowable removable expense because it's not really moving from A to B, it's just transferring from A to B. Traveling expenses to traders' places, traveling expenses overseas. Traveling expenses here for traders is considered as disallowable. But for businesses which you have to travel, if you're an architect, an engineer, an auditor, you must travel to the premises of a company to look at documentation, everything else. Yes, it's an allowable expense. Now, this is quite important. Counseling services for employees. Unfortunately, in Brunei at the moment and a lot of countries, because of COVID, there are a lot of people who have to not only, they've been made redundant or they have lost their jobs, and they need to be counseled. Yeah, there's a lot of mental and emotional distress, and that is quite a high expense now in a lot of developing countries. And in Brunei, I know a lot of businesses suffered, including my daughter's business. I advised her to close the business down because in this time of uncertainty, it's no point paying rental, no point trying to keep staff. Although the government says you should not close your business just because of COVID. Obviously, they don't understand business. And when we do the last chapter on terminal losses, that is quite relevant in terms of COVID, because when you close a business and you're forced to close, not because of COVID, but because of lack of market, lack of demand, and because of uncertainty, you are entitled to what's known as a terminal loss relief. Yeah? So that is quite relevant in a sense when a person makes a decision to close a business. Unfortunately, in Brunei, we don't have what is known as terminal loss relief. If I'm a Sdn Bhd in Brunei, I decide to close my business today because I just cannot continue, it's not running profitably. I cannot carry back my losses for 3 years to offset against the profit and get a tax refund. Brunei does not have that legislation in place, but the British tax authorities do allow you to get a tax refund if you decide to close your business and you carry back your losses for 3 years. And if you have paid your tax for the last 3 years, then you're entitled to a tax refund. Yeah. Okay, so counseling is important. Pension contribution, yes, is allowable. That's like TAP, SCP. Premium for insurance, allowable. Damages paid. It depends on what type of damages, yeah. And in improving an individual's personal security, for example, you need a car, you need to have certain protection because of the nature of your work, then it is allowable. So the underlying principle is to ensure that as long as the expense incurred again, is wholly exclusively incurred for the purpose of the business or generation of income, then it should be allowable. If any of you suddenly, next year gets a job in the tax department, hopefully will not blindly do what all the stuff I was doing in the past, just sending out letters to companies and asking them for detailed analysis of every expense. Because it is counterproductive. But the amendment to the tax laws in Brunei, but it's always been the case in the UK. As a tax authority, you have the power to investigate companies. You have the power to go to the company's premises and also look at the documentation that they have, to make sure that the documentations sufficiently support the expense. And in Brunei, a lot of my clients before, especially construction companies, you have many contracts. Sometimes you account it as a completed contract basis, sometimes on percentage of completion basis. And every contract has a separate file. And the tax department tends to ask for photocopies of all the supporting documents. And you can end up having 20, 30 boxes of documents sent to the tax department. And my clients are more than happy for the tax department to actually visit them. Look, come to our premises and look at the documents. We'll give you access to every document that you want. You need to review. But so far, the tax department in Brunei has not done on-site investigations. I think recently only one or two, but you're talking about 8,000 taxpayers, so that is a very small percentage of companies being investigated. But here are companies that are willingly asking them to come because they find it counterproductive to photocopy all these documents. And to tell you the truth, when you send 20 boxes to the tax department, they wouldn't know where to look anyway. There's so many things to look at. It's so voluminous. One of my clients, I think we submitted 12 boxes. And a few years later, the boxes were returned to them. They didn't come up with any questions. And to be honest, I don't think they even look at anything. They probably didn't know what to look at. Not to undermine their capabilities, but when you send, files and files of documentation, and if you are not sure what to look at, then you're not sure really where to look, what to look, and especially on a contract account, there's so many things to look at that you can get totally blinded by the documentation, by the expenses that has been charged. Okay, let's have a look. Just quickly go through page 118. Again, it's a similar kind of example, that we have previously, but in this case we have included impairment losses, which is trade, entertainment expenses for employees, patent royalties paid, legal expenses on acquisition of new factory. So again, it's the same principle. In exam questions, you're given the statement of profit and loss of an individual, the detail as shown here. Salaries include £15,000 paid to Steve's wife, who works full-time in the business. Okay, the difference between this, Stephen's wife here works full-time. The last example, the wife works part-time. So when you work full-time, generally the salaries will be fully deductible. And when you compute the adjustable taxable profit, you should start with a net profit of 17710. So it already tells you where to start. So then you just go through one by one. Wages and salaries included in the 59,000 is 15,000 paid to Steve's wife, who works full time. Okay. Melanie's salary is not excessive for full-time work because it's stated as full-time. Rent and rates is always allowable. Depreciation is always a disallowable item. Okay, so you add back. Next one is impairment loss. Trade. Since it's trade, it is allowable. If it's bracket non-trade, you add back that £150. Entertainment expenses for customers, as in the previous example, is not allowable. Royalties, patent, those are patents that you have to pay for the conduct of your business because you have certain patents and royalties for the use and the rights of using certain products. Legal expense on acquisition of a new factory. The legal expense is on a new factory. A new factory is a capital expenditure, and because it's capital in nature, it is not allowable. In some questions, there's 2 points. Yeah, legal expenses on acquisition of new factories. Maybe they put £150. Legal expenses on the recovery of trade debtors, £100. Then you disallow the capital part for the factory, and you allow the legal expense for the recovery of the bad debts. Yeah? And then there you are. Then you have your profit adjusted for tax purposes. Here it doesn't tell you what the capital allowance is, so you don't make any adjustments for capital allowances. This is for the purpose of this example, but usually when there is depreciation, there will always be capital allowances. Okay, so that's it really for this chapter. Again, the most important thing when if you're a policymaker and you decide to introduce whatever taxes in Brunei, you need to be mindful that as a taxpayer will always try to reduce their tax liability. Yeah, because who wants to pay tax? Nobody wants to pay tax, or at least pay some tax. So people tend to get a bit creative in the sense that they will charge certain expenses to reduce their tax liability. The most common one is increased bonuses, getting child allowances, management fees, technical support fees, manpower support fees. There are a lot of intercompany charges. Yeah? So, and from a personal income tax point of view, there may be a lot of expenses incurred, like traveling, entertainment, promotional, marketing, and whatever other expenses that they think they can get away with to reduce their tax liability. Yeah, so the most important thing that you need to understand is, yes, income is quite easy because you have a fixed salary, so you know what your salary is, or you have a business income. This is the expenses that the tax authorities will always want to check. So I'm a taxpayer, I want to reduce my tax liability. You're the tax authority, you want to make sure that he has not reduced his tax liability by claiming expenses which is not supposed to claim. Yeah. For example, like professional subscription membership. So, I claim not only for my accounting profession, I claim for chambers of commerce, I claim for other associations where they are not related to my business. So there will be an analysis of these expenses. More commonly for family-run business, probably that might be an issue in Brunei, is you may have wife, children working for the organization, and it'll be quite, if personal income tax does come in and you have a partnership, is how do the tax department determine what I pay my wife, what I pay my children is considered as fair and not excessive. Yeah, so that is a challenge for government if they do decide to impose taxation on partnership and sole proprietorship. If you pay a salary to spouses or to close family members, how do I know whether it's excessive or not? So they will need to do their own research as well, check on the industry. Is 10,000 too much to pay to my wife for the type of business that I have? They will never say it's too low. They always consider it high, and then they work backwards. Okay, if they think it's too high, what do they think is fair? Maybe they say for the nature of business, maybe only 5,000 is allowable. But their challenge is, which is also the challenge that they have now, is when they state that directors' fees can only be a maximum of 10,000. Anything more will be disallowable. We still haven't got anything in writing from the government as to why they have decided 10,000 is fair. Yeah, a company may only have a turnover of 1 million, and you pay 120,000 to yourself as a director. That's allowable. A company may have an income of 100 million. You pay yourself 120,000, or you decide to pay double that. They will say that anything more than 120 is disallowable. So far we have not seen any logical, justifiable explanation from the tax authorities. So as I mentioned, I think maybe 3-4 lectures ago about introduction to tax, when you have a tax system, it has to be fair, just, equitable, and transparent. Yeah. So if you state that based on the company size, you can only pay so much, then come up with a formulation. But if you have a blanket to say that I only allow up to 10,000, irrespective of size, then that is not just and equitable. Because the higher income, the higher your risk as well, as a director of a company. And if a company fails, you have much more higher liability that you may have to suffer compared to a smaller company. So I think the tax department needs to look at some sort of risk reward kind of scheme and come up with some sort of formulation. It's not easy, but they will have to do something. But I think if they do decide to have personal income tax, then depending on what the personal income tax rate compared to the corporation tax rate, then it might not be a major issue. Yeah? If the tax is exactly the same, so it doesn't matter. If I pay myself double, I still have to pay personal income tax. Yeah. So company has reduced tax, but I have additional tax. So again, it depends on the fiscal system of a country. What is corporation tax rate? What is the personal income tax rate? Yeah. That's something that you will have to consider. Okay, so for me, that's it. Any questions? I hope everybody has got a textbook or access to a textbook, because I tried to do PowerPoint, but I found it counterproductive. I don't like doing something that's already in the textbook, which you can actually follow anyway. Yeah. But as an academic exercise, is just for you to follow through. I mean, you don't even need to look at all of this to do your first assignment anyway. But I believe that if you understand how taxes are computed, what are the different kind of taxes, it will in some way help you, guide you, to do your tax assignment. Okay? Happy? Still awake? Still there?
Yes, sir, still here.
I only hear you, I don't hear the others, so maybe they're all gone already. Anyway, I trust you're all listening diligently. Yeah. Again, if you have started or made an attempt on your assignment, do send me a draft so that I can. The earlier you send to me, the better it is for you, in the sense that I can provide feedback, and then you have more time to prepare. I need to find out from Dr. Ado, or from the faculty, what is the date of the examination board meeting. Because if it's say in December, then I will extend the coursework to end of November, yeah, or early December anyway. So give you more time to do your coursework. Okay, that's it for me. Stay safe, stay healthy, and
thank you, sir.
Okay, see you next week. See your initials next week.
Thank you, sir.
Inshallah,
Okay.
take care, sir.
You all take care.
Thank you, sir.
Miss you all in class.
Assalamualaikum.
Waalaikumsalam. See you then. Bye.